Back in September of 2016, something started. Almost 5 years and very nearly 400 episodes later, here we are. Welcome to episode 399 of Trending in Education. It's been an amazing ride so far, and we're really just getting started. But before leaning into the future, we wanted to take a moment to reflect on and celebrate the past. For today's episode, we have a very special throwback to how it all began. An origin story edition with original hosts Brandon Jones, Dan Strafford, and Mike Palmer. We hope you enjoy this very special episode of Trending in Education. Welcome to Trending in Education, a very exciting episode here. We're taking it way back to where this whole thing began, this crazy madcap dream of ours. I have Brandon Jones and Dan Strafford with me for Trending in Ed. Welcome back to the show, Brandon and Dan.
Thanks. You, Mike. It can't go any further back than the first episode. When you said way back, it's the wayest back it can go.
It goes all the way back to September of 2016.
Woo!
We started something crazy. We started this podcast called Trending in Education, and we're coming up on our 400th episode, which is amazing. And I haven't had both of you on the show in a long time. I haven't had either of you individually on the show nearly as regularly as we did in the early days. Looks like we've done 137 shows, just the three of us, which is a lot. And I've done a bunch of shows one-on-one with each of you. We're coming up on 400 shows, but early days, it was just us. And for our listeners, they may not understand how this show came into being. I got my perspective, but I'd love to hear from each of you. So Brandon, I'd like to talk about origin stories on the show. Can you give us a little bit of the origin story of Trending in Education from your perspective?
You know, I think the origin story actually started pre-episode 1, coincidentally, where Mike, you and I had joked about, we basically were recording a pod before podcasts existed in just our colleagueship and friendship that we had at our former employer, Kaplan Test Prep. For years, we had what was probably the best material we ever had was pre-recording, and with Dan in there from day one as the third amigo in our group of three, really just trying to explore some new media, which I know you've continued to be at the forefront as even newer media has come along, but thinking, let's try our hand at podcasting. And we like education, we like trends, we like each other. And so I think it was born from a very natural, organic relationship that the three of us have to something that we wanted to do together.
Awesome. Dan, your thoughts?
Brandon, I think you're spot on. It just became an organic conversation between the two of you. I may have had some technical know-how in the space leading in, and from there, the rest, as they say, is history.
Yeah, and just to build on that, Dan, you were producing this not from the office. Correct. So Brandon and I would typically huddle
pre-COVID, people.
Pre-COVID. You were remote.
That's right.
From way back. But we inherited from Slate, right, which was also a Graham Holdings company while we were at Kaplan. They bequeathed to us what was called a whisper room. I later found out it was called the Chamber of Secrets, named from Harry Potter. Right. But a lot of great stuff apparently happened in there over the years at Slate. And then they dropped it in the midst of our offices, and not far from where I worked, and Brandon was down the hall from us. And you could comfortably fit maybe two people in there. Sometimes we would have three, and then Dan would be on the monitor at the end of the desk there and imparting his morsels of wisdom from the greater Boston area. But it's a shout out to our friends at Slate who bequeathed that to us. I always liken it to The Gods Must Be Crazy, a film back in the 90s when a Coke bottle falls in sub-Saharan Africa and then all heck breaks loose. They think of it in really interesting ways, but it did almost feel like a psychology, sociology experiment where let's drop this capability into their midst and see what happens. And voila, here we are 400 episodes later.
That's right.
Yeah, the Whisper Room professionalized our efforts, not just in terms of sound, but also gave us a place to do this. Our colleagues would wonder what was going on when the two of us would walk into the room, close the door, and be in there for an hour. I would sometimes wonder what happened when I was walking out of that room an hour later. But it was fun. It got a little hot in
That's what
there.
I was gonna say.
You know, some Christmas lights or holiday lights in there, some low lighting, and not a whole lot of air circulation. But it wasn't just temperature hot. There was some hot ideas being laid down in that room as well. Hot takes, hot pockets. It was no hot pockets, but everything else there was. Those are fun days.
Yeah. And we were always talking about moving the program forward and how could you. We didn't monetize, but I remember joking once that one way to monetize was we were in Midtown East. I thought we could open up a couple tables there and start serving lunch through the Whisper Room, which never quite panned out. But it was almost like you enter a different world where you were in there. One of our recurring imaginary guests was Elon Musk. Yeah. So from the early days, way back in 2016, we were inspired by the imagination and the potentiality of Elon, and we shouted at him out frequently. Many things have changed over the years, but in some ways, Elon is still here and he's still a guy who's ahead of the curve. Any reflections on a friend of the show, at least hypothetical friend of the show, Elon Musk over the years?
I mean, his roller coaster ride since we first invited him on the show, I don't want to lay claim to some of his crazy antics, but it might have been influenced by us inviting him. But I think obviously the imagination you talk about is what inspired me most. Is just the way he thinks is different than most, right? Yeah. So you get to think about something like Neuralink, which we joked a lot about with Brandon saying, hook me up, I'm ready to go. And that's
back of my head is ready. It's still ready, Elon.
It's becoming more and more possible. And you're seeing the space race now between all these billionaires with Branson and Bezos and Musk all going, though Musk has opted out of actually doing it himself, which seems like the sanest thing he's done of late. And then you have Dogecoin of late and Bitcoin and all those stories. And thanks, Elon. Made a few coins off of your Dogecoin calls. I appreciate that. But it's an interesting world to track someone of that mindset. And I think he always just gave us inspiration in thinking differently and bringing to market things that people always thought was science fiction.
Yeah, the Boring Company. You can't not have an opportunity to make a joke about the Boring Company because it's called the Boring Company. And Elon was just very much part of the collective imagination. We like to talk about getting zeitgeisty, that he was very much of that type. And the show has been about education, but it's also been about being in the world and trying to understand what's new and emerging in the world around us. Brandon, any thoughts on some of the topics or themes that we covered over the years that still resonate when you think back at your experiences with Trending Ahead?
Yeah, I think we covered a lot of ground, and a lot of it was very rich. I think there are some things that obviously come to mind. I hearted bots. I would say I heart bots a lot. I still heart bots. That was past. And
I less than 3 bots was the line that
I less than 3 bots. That's right. Thanks, Dan, for bringing it back. Yeah, we talked about a lot around AI and AR and VR, the centaurs, the virtual humans. I think wasn't a term we were using back then, but I think that was a trend that I know maybe it is still in the early days, but we were in the early days pre those days. These days, can't offer reflections without giving shout outs to Robocon. For those who haven't listened to that episode, go back and listen to it. But also, it is just an arm that was developed to take a Japanese entrance exam for college. Had 4 chances and failed on each of its 4 chances. And then, as we imagined again, theater of the mind, imagine it being sent out to a Toyota factory, building Camrys and going and looking sadly in the windows of a college that it wanted to get into. Yeah, it inspired me to think a little outside the lane of what my day job was at Kaplan, to think about what was new and what was maybe even not now, but coming. And I think that has been a trend that I'm a listener to the show now, no longer a host, but that has been a trend that I give you credit, Mike, for continuing.
Yeah, and for me, I'm just struck by the practice. You talked to me about practice, but the practice of trying to identify trends does change the way you think and the way you operate. And then the other thing that I think you were touching on a little bit there, Dan, too, is like, we didn't pod fade. Like, there are a lot of examples of podcasts that start and stop. These technologies are all democratized nowadays, just that anybody can do one or a few. It's hard to do 400. And part of that is because you got to build it into how you think, how you operate, how you engage with the world. But I think it helps. For me, on a personal level, it created a flywheel for myself where I'm forced to read more books, more articles, stay more abreast of what's emerging in the world around me. And hopefully that makes the content better, but that definitely makes us better. Any thoughts on that, Dan?
I've talked about it before on the show, and both of you coming from the fantasy sports world largely is where I used to podcast. That I could fake largely, like that I could get away with talking about the day's sports, right? The daily aspect of something and being able to speak to it on the fly. Whereas the subject matter we dove into here for me personally was outside of my typical realm of expertise. So it did lend itself to me growing as an employee of the company I'm still with, but the idea also of just thinking differently about how to approach research, how to learn more, what to read, what not to read, what to ignore, what to stay away from. I use the Gartner hype cycle, its methodology, as a reference point more and more now. I got big in, I know I talked to you about, Mike, the NFTs, the NBA Top Shot of the world. I got pretty heavily into that, but you saw it follow the hype cycle. Like, it's in the trough right now. And you can see it with Google Trends too. It's all on the same thing. And just learning those things along the way have made me, one, more knowledgeable, but I think more aware of what I need to learn more about, more aware of how to lean in and keep moving forward.
Yeah. And for me, when the Gartner hype cycle comes out or when the Meeker report comes out, it's like a mini holiday.
I just texted you, the Coursera World Report just came out. I sent you a text.
Global Skills Index. Yeah. Lots of water off ducks' backs. Stuff happened. We learned a lot over the years. And then Brandon, you were the first to embark out of the Kaplan mothership. That was back in the summer of 2019. What's it been like since you left? Because you've been back on the show a handful of times. I know you're doing a lot of interesting work in behavioral health. You've been showing up more now as someone who's wearing a new hat as an expert in an adjacent space around behavioral health. And I know also at Triad, where you are now, you've also launched a podcast. So any reflections on what you learned through your run here and how you've been able to think about it now that you're wearing different hats?
Certainly, let me start with the last part, which is the work that we did together on trending in education, beyond the work that we did for our work, was really helpful in setting us up. Our podcast is called Behavioral Health Today. It covers trending topics in behavioral mental health, which I think just personally, professionally, both a really important topic and space and market from a commercial perspective. And you, Mike, helped us launch this podcast. Yeah. We are just past our 1-year anniversary this April. We're closing in on 50,000 listens, which is an exciting milestone for us. It was a long way of saying thank you to both of you for having been there with me along the way, that then as I left from under one roof to another, brought some of those learnings to launch a new podcast. And then beyond that, in general, learnings and reflections, it's been quite a time since 2019, not just for me having left the place and joined a new place, but the world. It's been a couple years. I listened to the New Normal for Learning episode, and I had some thoughts on some things that I think are becoming normal from my seat, and both as a person and as a professional.
Yeah, we'll want to get into that. And then I wound up leaving Kaplan back in the end of the December of 2019, leaving Dan and sometimes guest correspondent Melissa Griffith still at the Kaplan mothership. And we've been able to keep you connected in some ways, Dan. But what's it been like from your perspective in the intervening time since the Three Amigos? And I'm still trying to figure out who do I want to be? I think you probably want to be Steve Martin.
Probably, yeah.
Well, for me, it's funny. We talked about at the start that we were doing this pre-COVID with the remote production, right?
Yeah.
And doing that. And I've been doing it since I moved up to Massachusetts, working for you, Mike, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
And personally, that was a rocky transition for me because I've been in office for so long. And a lot of what I did was on site. And learning this new world earlier than most made specifically the past year easier for me and honestly more lucrative for me because I was able to insert skills that I learned doing things like this into the world that everyone was all of a sudden getting used to. Remote production, remote learning, something Mike, you champion, Brandon, you championed as well at Kaplan and now beyond. We were already ahead of that curve. So what I found over the past 2 years creating content and the past year specifically is that people are understanding now the difficulty of it, what we were able to do for so long, the content, to your point, not pod fading, like doing this on a regular basis and making it accessible and good and worthwhile. I think more and more people are finally getting a sense of how hard that is. I think also education wise, it's made me, what we did, able to help my kids when they were virtual learning, like able to think through, okay, this was difficult for me working from home because of XYZ, or Brandon and I communicated well doing this. Maybe I need to talk to their teacher about something different in a way. So it made me more available to do that. I will say the past year has made it interesting because now almost everybody can do what I've been doing for 4 or 5 years.
Yeah.
So it's now trying to stay ahead of trend. What you've talked about so often, like trying to look ahead, skate to where the puck is going, the phrase Gretzky, obviously, but you've used several times. It's tough. Like it's a tough thing to stay ahead of. All right, is TikTok really where I need to look at? I don't need to be on TikTok, but is that what I need to be doing? And I think this show and the way you both think and the way you had me thinking about how to produce helps in that way of trying to stay ahead a little bit.
Yeah, yeah. And we're going to try to get some thoughts about that from each of you as we start looking ahead. Brandon was talking about the new normal. But before we do that, there's a couple of the things I wanted to hit on. One was some of the live events that we did, really 2 in particular. One was with Wendy Zuckerman from Science Versus at the Javits Center in October of 2018 at the National Association of Broadcasters event there. Brandon and I interviewed Wendy, who's just brilliant. But that was a very vivid memory that I had, an amazing moment. And then the 3 of us were down at South by Southwest EDU in the spring of 2019.
Right.
And we're good at live, despite how carefully edited all of our episodes are. But any thoughts on those moments? Maybe start with you, Brandon, because I remember the Wendy moment, it was certainly a high point so far in my podcasting career. But I don't know if you have any thoughts on either Wendy or other moments along the way.
Yeah, I'll share thoughts on both. I'll start by saying I recently went to the Javits Center to get my COVID vaccination shots. So
nice.
From Javits to Javits in my arm. And I did, as I was there waiting in what was actually an impressively short line for the number of people they were vaccinating. I did think about the last time that I had been there, which was for the live show recording. It was a trade show floor, and we were there recording a show on the floor. And it felt like, and hopefully the sort of ambience noise that came through and the sound pickup in the background, you could hear it, but it felt very live, right? In a way, it was different than South by Southwest, which I'll talk about in a second. But there we had random passersby coming and seeing, what are these guys and gal and their cans doing here? What is this? Recording a what? It felt cool because we were picking up people who were just walking the trade show floor and weren't necessarily looking for a podcast, but then stuck around. We gathered a little humble brag made for good for podcasting, brushing this off. We attracted a bit of a crowd, which was nice. Wendy was a great guest, obviously. I really enjoyed speaking with her. And the Science Versus, boy, do we need Science Versus as a general theme. I thought that was a lot of fun. And then South by Southwest was different, no less good, but just differently good, in as much it was a session with a dedicated audience who showed up to hear the conversation. But I also thought that was good. It felt like an authentic conversation. We interviewed Ashley Manka from ACT. We had her join us. And it's a different kind of energy. I mean, I feel like from a certain perspective, everything recorded is also live. This is happening live right now.
Wait, what?
Even if you're not hearing it live, like we're all live, but it felt authentic. But there's also a different kind of energy when there are other humans in the room who are looking at you, listening to you, and hopefully laughing along with you or learning along with you and enjoying the conversation. So I remember both those vividly and fondly.
Yeah. And it's interesting, in the last year, all of those conference experiences have moved to the same format that you're talking about. So a lot of podcasters are now doing live webinars, live events. It's something that we've been experimenting with a little bit here on the show. It's something that continues to be a trend. But then, Dan, I remember we were ready to fly down to South by Southwest for our heroic second engagement when a little something called the coronavirus happened. And I remember I was flying out that Saturday morning and South by Southwest was canceled that Friday night. So I already had an Airbnb booked for my wife and 1-year-old son at the time. We were going to hang out in Austin, have a great time, because Austin's that's a fun conference. But any reflections on live experiences or other things that kind of jump to mind around your run on training and education?
Absolutely. So the NAB, what Brandon described, is what I love, is that almost accidental interactions you can have with people on that trade floor where things are just happening all around. The first South by Southwest experience, you knew what you were getting into. you saw the show. And I have to give credit to you both and also Mike, your approach, South by Southwest EDU really adopted a lot of what we talked about with the podcasting for the next year. They were going to have a podcast stage and they were going to have a specific place for these things to be recorded. I was psyched. My wife and I were going. My wife was presenting. Workshop. I was home on my daughter's 10th birthday. So we're watching the news. And at this point, we're both sitting there and my wife is immunocompromised. So her doctor's like, it's fine. You fly down there. It'll be fine. No big deal. And okay, cool. Got the doctors and then we're just watching. And then slowly things start getting canceled. But they're coming back around. I think to your point, virtual has become the new norm. Forward-facing hybrid is a word that is probably being overused right now, but this mixed modal way of delivering live events is going to be here for a while. And I think people are learning from that. But I think the live you all did at South by Southwest further legitimized what we were doing with the podcast. It further showed that, yes, we edit this, but there's a conversational tone to this podcast specifically and to what this conversation around education is that I really think is much more approachable than most. And again, that's not always a teachable thing. And I think you've seen that over the past year as you see people do live webinars and see people do virtual events where this doesn't feel quite right anymore. And I'm pretty proud of the stuff we were able to do from a live perspective as well. We went live on YouTube, which I think was well received.
You and I went live with Melissa and Rohit Bhargava for another session. It's nice, they're little test labs. We're always cooking up new stuff. The other thing I wanted to talk quickly about was March Madness over the years, which was a real story tradition. We wound up skipping March Madness this year.
Because it was all mad.
It's going to come back. We did even do it in 2020 through the craziness of the first wave of the coronavirus. But it was a really interesting thing that we did on the regular. And then Brandon, I'd love to get your perspective because you and I wound up squaring off sometimes. It was a fun format. Sometimes we kind of got ahead of some stuff and we were on the record with our prediction. So any thoughts on that?
Yeah. So March Madness 1, which I guess was in March 2017. We really did some preparation that just was unsustainable. We had prepared
debates
back and forth set pieces.
There were rap battles.
Rap battles, exactly. Some epic rap battles where it was all in good spirit and good fun. We were all trying to do this in the midst of our day jobs and giving us credit. We did show up prepared to talk to guests, having read articles, book excerpts, books. Those were some fun days, the March Madness, especially March Madness round 1. And then we did get ahead of some trends. One that I had cited was kid solving, which I think was true in the moment, obviously through the tragedy of the Parkland school shooting, but also with climate change and Greta. It is evident through some new media how capable young people are. Watch out, world. Young people can change it and hopefully will for the better. But there were a number of trends that we identified. We spent a lot of time thinking about the future and about the present and forecasting out trend lines. And I think we did pretty well.
Yeah. And it's become part of what I'm trying to do now with this show is extend what we did March Madness really throughout the year. And in addition to March Madness, we also were staying on top of what's new and emerging in the world of media and entertainment. So I did like that we were not pigeonholed into just talking about a narrow slice of education. We were trying to play with our heads up and make connections across the world around us, beginning first in 2017 with the launch of a spinoff show called The Citadel, where we would break down what happened on Game of Thrones, both for season 7, which was in 2017, and then when Game of Thrones was back in 2019, we were following along the bumpy ride that was season 8 of Game of Thrones. We talked about Black Panther. We talked about Black Mirror and Bandersnatch. We did a bunch of sports shows. What can you learn from sports? That in some ways that's turned into another podcast I do now with a colleague of ours, Tarlin Ray, running it back, Lessons Learned from Sports. But any thoughts about The Citadel? Because for me, that's definitely something I'll always be proud of. And I always have very fond memories because as a trend that was impacting the broader culture, Game of Thrones was really up there. The world was different when those episodes were coming out and we were staying right up on top of it.
I'll offer a couple quick thoughts first, and then Dan, happy to hear yours too. We made a credible effort at first. This is gonna be some real
tying.
talk here.
Yeah, tying. Yeah.
We made some incredible effort to tie it to education.
Yes.
You know, we were talking about education in Westeros and Essos, and learning and how learning happened and communication there. That lasted for probably about 2 episodes of the Citadel, and then we were just talking about the cultural phenomenon that was Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
I guess obviously I want everybody to extract value from everything, but I'm fairly unapologetic about the fact that we were talking about something which was in the cultural milieu. And I think we were doing it in a way where we were trying to make it interesting and accessible. And so I would argue, here's the meta connection to learning, is that if you were listening and enjoying that listening experience, there was probably some learning that you were doing real time. I liked those shows, and we continue to drop core training and education content every week. If you wanted to tune out for the Citadel and tune in for core training and education, we were there for you. If you wanted to listen both, we were there for you twice. So I thought that was a lot of fun. And I guess one last note on that before Dan turned over to you. The fun part was not unintentional. We took a topic which in some cases, not all cases, but in some cases, education and K-12, higher ed, even some of the newer forms of education learning can be a little dry and academic. Mm-hmm. And we intended to infuse some personality. Now, unfortunately for all you listeners, it was our 3 personalities, so you were stuck with what you got. But we tried to infuse some personality and some fun into what we did. And I think the Citadel sort of was born out of that. So in a way, even when we stopped trying to tether back with the tenuousness of that tether, it was still really born from what we were trying to do around training and education.
Yeah.
And we did get to talk about, I think Columbia had a grad course based off of Game of Thrones. I know Indiana University had, it's like from Westeros to Wall Street or something along those lines. So it did also work that way.
Duolingo, I'm interrupting you, sorry, but Duolingo had a Dothraki language.
There was a great article about epidemiology from Westeros, which I thought was really relevant in light of the pandemic and everything. So there are ways to make connections.
And I think we were having fun, and discussing the show also was cathartic a lot of the times that last season, because there were times we logged on and you could hear the anger in all 3 of our voices of, all right, there's another bad episode.
Yeah.
It was fun. It was different. And it allowed, again, palate cleansing of sorts for the listener and for us to be able to transition, talk about something we loved, something we were really into and have passion about outside of the typical topics. Mike, you said it before. There are people who really liked that off-ramp, really liked the idea of, oh, wait, this is cool to listen to. They have opinions about this completely different topic, but still speak about it in an eloquent way. I think it was awesome.
Yeah. And I think we're intentionally trying to make connections that are broad. Freud talked about the narcissism of small differences, where people get into their lane and they think it's all about the specifics within their little niche. And one of the express intents of this show is to try to look across and make those types of connections, which hopefully have a little bit of fun along the way. We're getting close to time here. I want to pivot towards the future, which is something that we like to do on this show regularly. Any reflections? What's capturing your imagination these days? What do you see on the horizon?
I like lists. That was another thing. Every time there was a list, we had some quizzes that Dan, you were kind enough to prepare for us. I have no quizzes today, but I do have a list. So there are 5 things that I think for me are on the horizon, not specifically learning related, although some of them are tied to it. As I thought about the new normal, I liked listening to that show, as I mentioned, and I like thinking about where we're going, where we are. I'll give the list of 5 with maybe a teaser comment about each. Here's the list to start. Under the construct of the new normal, there are 5 things I have. 1, relationship redefinition. The teaser on that is relationship ellipses with people, with work, with learning, and with self, which leads into thing number 2, which I'm trying to think of as the qualified self, as different from the quantified self, which has been a movement that obviously has been gaining traction over the last many years. Some real non-quantitative self-examination and self-reflection and taking self-stock. We've all spent a lot of our times in a much smaller world over the past year and a half. And whether that's however your family or friend or solo group is configured, it featured a lot more you. And so I think that's going to be coming out is maybe some purposeful self-qualification. Also related to that in both good and less good ways, thing number 3 is mental well-being. both mental health and also mental wellness. Whomever you are, wherever you are, you were impacted in some way, and some of those are more acute. Some of those are very positive. You may have been inspired to be proactive about your wellness, including mental wellness. But I think just much more awareness, and will continue to be, around mental well-being in the future than in the even recent past. 4 of 5, or 80% of the way there now, is what I'm thinking about as polarization versus divergence, where, not to put too much of a stamp on this, versus bleak versus hopeful. One of those things, divergence, whether that's diversity of any kind, including neurodiversity, that is, I think, objectively positive. Polarization, I think, is a worse version of that. And I think we're teetering on that line where there is much more awareness of diversity and the value of diversity than divergence, which I think is very positive. There is also a possibility that we end up in a much more polarized future. And so I would love, the opposite of polarization in my mind is not harmonization. It's divergence and celebrating diversity in a way that is really positive. So I think that's hopefully a trend that we're heading to. And then finally, 5 is capstone all this is what I'm thinking of as purposefully new. So what I hope, I guess if I could have one line that I would leave listeners with, what I hope is that as we're getting back to new normal, I ate in a restaurant 2 weeks ago for the first time in 14 months. I got on a plane a couple of weeks ago for the first time in 14 months. I'm seeing my family, my parents, for the first time in 16 months. These are all normal things, I would say, that I haven't done in long enough to make them no longer feel normal.
Yeah.
What I'm hoping is that as we're coming back out, as the world is reopening, is that we, each of us and collectively, we're really reflecting on what are those things we want to bring back to normal, and what are those things that we'd be okay with not bringing back to normal, so that our new normal, whatever it is, I hope there is purpose and intentionality in it.
Great stuff, man. You didn't skip, and there's plenty more within that list. We'll have to figure out how to get more of that from you. Dan, you ready to follow that? That was pretty good.
For me, I'm waiting for the pendulum to swing back in the other direction. I think we've seen the at least acknowledgement that virtual works, or e-learning, whatever phrase you want to use that's out there. I do start to think this college year is going to be very indicative of how higher education moves forward. I don't think higher ed is ready for hybrid. I don't think higher ed is ready for an embrace of cheaper cost, of reducing costs and doing those things. So I think higher ed is going to be that line in the sand in a lot of ways over the next year or two of how we move forward. I think the definition of hybrid in the next 6 months is going to matter. And I think people understanding what hybrid actually means in their context is going to matter. I had a friend say, oh, I'm taking a hybrid online course. I said, okay, what does that mean? In person, then you take online class? She goes, no, it's online. I said, what does that mean though? Oh, they have videos on demand and we do message board. That's not hybrid. All right. So we need to define what it is. So over the next 6 months, to me, we're going to have to understand what people think the next phase of learning is. And I think the last thing for me that we're going to see more of, and I've already started talking to my oldest about this, is everything's going to be recorded. And I mean that in the sense that that's a positive for classes, right? I miss a class or I didn't really understand something. I can go back and learn again from the professor who's the sage on the stage, or a discussion group. I can listen back to it. But it's also all of our movements are being recorded.
Yeah.
Data's there. Everything we're learning is being recorded. The data is there. And actually, video wise, so much is being recorded. And just understanding the implications, both from a learning sense and from a personal sense, and being attuned and opting out where you need to opt out, and saying, no, I'm not going to log in, or I'm not going to turn my camera on, or I'm not going to be in this place that everything I do is someone else's data point. We've talked about it before, the quantified self. I think there are opt-out moments that people are going to have to start making decisions, both in education and in their personal lives.
Yeah. Great stuff. Privacy is going to be huge. Yeah. So I think we've whetted people's appetite. Hopefully the two of you are excited to come back for more.
Absolutely.
And also, speaking about relationships we have together here, that's what it's all about. And it's always great to have some continuity. We're talking about coming up on 5 years of having conversations about where the world is headed. That's pretty fantastic. I deeply appreciate having both you in my life on this show so that we can have great conversations. Hopefully our listeners enjoy. As Ethel Merman famously said, it's better to sing one song too few than one song too many. So I think folks may want more from y'all. But thanks so much for coming back and reliving some of our memories on today's show.
Thanks, Mike.
Thanks for having us and for all the memories,
Yeah,
including those to be made.
Exactly. And for our listeners, if you like what you're hearing, write us a review, tell your friends, share the good word. We'll be back again soon. This is Trending in Education.